Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone in the Legislative Assembly Chamber of the Parliament of Western Australia, and to our participants online. Welcome to you all on behalf of Michelle Roberts, our Joint President of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association WA branch, and myself, Alana Clossy, President of the Legislative Council of Western Australia. I welcome you to our 2021 Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Australia and Pacific Region Conference. To formally welcome us to country, I introduce Dr. Richard Wally, Noongar statesperson.
Ko kerla ngara jer jenang nonok jenengan wajak buja ngara mot buja mamen jenang ngara wangin nonok yai mamen jenang nonok kadijen wangin ko kadijen wangin kaiwa berwan ngani wangin ke wangin mamen jenang nonok ngara mot nonok kur mot jenengan ngara yai kaiwa nonok jenengan ngara o buja ngara kur mot jenengan buja wangin buja pobrada wangin ngantai wangin buja kau nona jenengan kangin bidi nona pobrada bidi no bidi gan kar kumba and maragara ngalamor karigen buja kau. So may the good spirit be with each and every one of you. This is the Wajak section of the Noongar language group. I ask the good spirit to keep you safe during your presentations. Give those who are presenting the ability to articulate your messages. Those who receive the message have the capacity to pass it on to those who require it. It's a place where we call a place of gathering, and it's a place of learning. Our learning is called Karajan. Karajan is the Kartan Dijen, so we have the practical as well as the theory, so we speak and do. It's a place where we link from the park up the top that links us into a ridge that goes all the way down the centre of the city, down to what we call Maragarup, is the place of the Harrison Island, in Kakarnap. These places are significant for us because they are places where we made conversation and decision, but more importantly, we created storylines and songlines. And our information was passed down through storylines and songlines. So this morning I'd give you a little bit of history of this place and this connect and link you then at the end of it with a song. So Karakumba, it's got many names called Kings Park. Karakumba, Kart is a place, a head or a high place. A hill is called Kart. Kumba is significant, it's a significant place. It's got many other names because other families have dreaming stories to it. It's known as Jinning Bo, it's known as Karkanup, and Karakarta, Karamuru, and so one place can have 3 or 4 different names. And our family call it Karakumba, place of significance. My grandmother's great-grandmother was born on Harrison Island, in Maragarup. Her grandfather met Sterling down the bottom of Spring Street, which is just a walk from here when they first come. So our family connect goes back to that estimated 2,000 generations to this area. So as I speak to you in the language, we have never broken that language, so it's still connected for that 2,000 generations, and we're very blessed to have that here. I will finish by saying our processes of respecting people from other areas used to take anything from 5 minutes to 5 days. When people come from other countries, they'd stay on the outskirts of the country, make a fire, and wait by the fire until they're welcomed in. And if they know they're coming for good, the welcoming is done in 5 minutes. So this morning is a 5-minute presentation. If they think there's something suspicious, you'll sit for 2 days. If they don't trust you at all, you stay for 5 days, and you're still there after 5 days. That means your patience and you've thought about it, the respect has set in, you'll be welcomed in after that. So that process has been taking place for thousands of generations. And so when I do the welcomes and we do welcomes and acknowledgements today, we're tapping into that legacy. I will finish up with a song called Jinning and Bo. Jinning and Bo is looking in the distance. And one of the great reminders for us is how we work cohesively together as a people and a collective. And one of those reminders is the dark hills. We call that the Karamunda, or the Darling Ranges. The Darling Ranges is a joining point between Wajak and Ballarong. So I've got connections to both families. We don't have border lines that separate. We have joining lines that bring us together. So the same song, Jinning and Bo, that links us to Ballarong, Ballarong links to us, both ways. So we are blessed to be standing in a place where no armed, organised conflict ever took place. No wars ever took place in this place here. So we're very blessed. And that was because of that blueprint of social, environmental, and cultural harmony with each other. Thanks for including a welcome. We know it was by choice. We do not take welcomes for granted. Every time we do it, we open up the spirituality and portal of our ancestry to keep everyone safe in a spiritual sense. Ngala jirap jinang nanak wangin buruan nanak wangin nakarijan wangin kaya kopra kaya. May I say you have a successful conversation, a fruitful couple of days if you're here together for those times, and be safely taken back to your families at the end of these presentations. Jinning and Bo, Jinning and Bo, Kada Munda, Jinning and Bo, Kada Kumba, Jinning and Bo, Ngala Boyja, Jinning and Bo, Jinning and Bo. Jinning and Bo, Jinning and Bo, Ngala Boyja, Jinning and Bo, Nyonga Boyja, Jinning and Bo, Wajak Boyja, Jinning and Bo, Jinning and Bo. Jinning and Bo, Ngala calling, Jinning and Bo, Jena calling, Jinning and Bo, Ngala Boyja, Jinning and Bo, Jinning and Bo. Jinning and Bo, Jinning and Bo, Mam and Jenangar, Jinning and Bo, Mam and Jinning and Bo, Mam and Jinning and Bo. Kaya Wanju, Mama Jenang, may the good spirit be with you. And again, thanks for including a welcome, and I'll leave you to carry on your business. Thank you, sister.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wally, and we indeed feel welcome on Noongar country. We now move on to the official opening, and we're very fortunate to have with us to conduct the official opening of the conference, Professor Colleen Hayward. Professor Hayward is a senior Noongar woman, and she has over the years provided significant input into policies and programs on a wide range of issues. She was formerly the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Equity and Indigenous People at Edith Cowan University, and in 2012, Colleen was inducted into the Western Australian Women's Hall of Fame. She was also recognised as a member of the General Division of the Order of Australia. For those who follow AFL, Professor Hayward is on the board of the Fremantle Football Club, and you should not hold that against her. Spoken like a Collingwood supporter. With apologies to our friends from the Pacific region who may not follow that football reference, but it runs deep. We are very honoured to have with us Professor Colleen Hayward. Please make her welcome.
She's always just a little bit tricky. I too begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on lands that are part of the traditional country of the people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I particularly acknowledge my good friend Richard Wally for his formal welcome to country, and I add my own welcome to you all. As Richard has shared, welcomes to and acknowledgements of country are an important protocol. They offer a special greeting and set the context of us being here together, albeit some of that togetherness is virtual. I don't really know where to look for that, by the way. Where are they? Oh. I like to describe such greetings as akin to a warm handshake or hug, even though we've all had to be somewhat circumspect in our modes of greeting each other during these COVID times. As you will appreciate, many of the sub-themes of your conference are not ones on which it's appropriate for me to comment, but I have considered those that are relevant and where I think some of what I have to say might add to your own deliberations. Some of my comments will be personal perspectives, while others have considerable widespread resonance, especially in the Aboriginal community. And I have tried to be a bit controversial, not to disrespect, but rather to prompt thought, conversation, and even debate. As I unpack this presentation, it will become obvious that my thinking, like the thinking of Aboriginal people on many issues, is non-linear. It circles again and again, in part reinforcing that all the bits are interrelated. Just as a note here, it is important for us to all recognise that on any topic of importance, it is generally seen to be a good thing to have a diversity of views expressed in any debate or consideration. For instance, if we were considering the environment or climate change, we'd be somewhat negligent if all the views expressed came from one perspective only. The same applies to the views of Indigenous or First Nations peoples. In Australia, we have hundreds of First Nations. Each has its own culture, customs, law, and language. While some of these things might be common across groups, our diversity is widespread, and so are our views. We do not all think alike. Similarly, I do not purport to speak for all Aboriginal people, and I do not speak, other than in very general terms, for Torres Strait Islander people. It is up to each to speak for ourselves, hopefully with the support of others. I'd also like to suggest that government ought not be considered only in terms of the Parliament, that in fact it encompasses all the work done and or overseen by government, including through its departments or agencies, as well as the others who may be contracted to perform certain roles or run particular programs. In other words, what government does goes way beyond the laws it makes. It goes to the interpretation of those laws, and more so, the way they are implemented, the things that become practice. In that light, I cannot think about the need for improvements in the health sector without recalling the circumstances of my dad, who, after suffering a heart attack, was left unattended on a gurney in the corridor of a country hospital, just another Aboriginal man, until someone recognised him as the principal of a local school and insisted that he be given attention more conscientiously. Dad has been passed for a long time now, but I wonder how many others of our families are left waiting until someone thinks to get them the attention they need and, quite frankly, deserve. Similarly, I cannot think about the justice sector without recalling the time I reported to police that a person was acting suspiciously in my street as he checked cars to see if they were locked and what might have been left inside, only to be asked on that call if the person was Aboriginal. Of course, I was able to assure the police officer who took my call that the person in question was not Aboriginal, and that I knew that because I am. Moreover, I cannot think about the education system without also thinking about the number of times one hears anecdotally that some students, often Aboriginal students, are encouraged to stay away from school on the day of NAPLAN assessments, lest they bring down the school's NAPLAN score. But Before that sounds like only criticism, I hasten to add counter experiences to that mix. In health, for instance, when I had to rock up to see a specialist but left after a 3-hour wait without having been seen, my GP came to my home to make sure that I did go back and that I was seen in a timely way. Given my diagnosis was one of cancer, that extra step by the GP most likely saved my life. On the justice front, I should also say that it was police officers who were at my home one night when the home alarm had gone off, and that they not only checked everything inside and outside the house in terms of my safety, but also reassured me that in anticipation I might get a little shaky following the incident, they'd wait outside for 15 minutes to make sure not only that I was okay, but that I felt I was. And in the education context, we have to recognise and celebrate the work being done through the Aboriginal Cultural Standards Framework and towards culturally responsive leadership and the teaching of Aboriginal languages in schools. I could, of course, work my way through good and not so good examples pertaining to most, if not all, agencies, especially if we, the people, were to prioritise issues pertaining to improvements in our life circumstances. All of us will be familiar with the term colonising as well as decolonising. Those who seek to empathise with First Nations people endeavour to understand the meaning of both terms. The former is easier for all of us, the latter less so. And to be honest, in my view, we, Aboriginal people, have not really had the words to explain the concept of decolonising. We've not been able to help even well-meaning non-Indigenous people walk a mile in our shoes. We now have a perfect example, but I'll come back to that in a while. I want first to talk a little about the process of government. We all know that the advent of electorate boundaries is a bit artificial, albeit there is a rationale about such boundaries that ordinary people like me have to believe is not about an electoral advantage. Aboriginal people know that our state and territory boundaries are also artificial. For us, they are simply lines drawn on a map for convenience as much as rationale. I say this because there are a number of Aboriginal nations whose lands cross those artificial boundaries. An example is the Murruwanggadjurung people, whose lands are in what we now know as the East Kimberley and western parts of the Northern Territory. We know where our lands are. We also know who our leaders are. Traditionally, people were identified from an early age as to their abilities and the traits that should be fostered and developed to enable each person to excel in those areas of strength. Nowadays, lots of that continues, but it's an area where at least some of our cultural standards have been compromised. That conversation is one for a different time. But it does go to your sub-theme of sovereignty and representation of First Nations peoples in Parliament. I have frequently been asked if I'd thought about going into politics. For me, it was a dilemma for a couple of reasons. The main one being that if a party supports your candidature, I believe you owe an allegiance to that party and its policies, including those that may put you at odds with what you, as an Aboriginal person, know is different to an Aboriginal worldview. I chose to not be caught in that dilemma, but that was just my choice. There is no question that we need First Nations people in our representative structures. How else would government ever hear the voice of First Nations peoples on all matters before it, as opposed to the consultations that happen around specific issues, as though we're not affected by everything government does, not just the bits that have the word Aboriginal in the title. Moreover, our future generations need to be able to see Aboriginal people involved in the representative process so they too can aspire to be involved. There is also no question Aboriginal people so involved will face similar such dilemmas as just outlined. Are they Aboriginal people who happen to be in politics, or are they politicians who happen to be Aboriginal? That is not an easy question to answer, but it is a very real question just the same. And, as if that's not enough, I propose something further. An Aboriginal person elected to a political position does not stop them from being Aboriginal. Their Aboriginality should be celebrated and supported, and that includes them working in Aboriginal ways, not leaving all their Aboriginal ways of being at the door and somehow being expected to still do a good job. We all know the value of diversity in our deliberations, whatever they may be. I find in every context that just being in the room changes the conversation. If Aboriginal people or issues might not have been in the mix of a conversation, someone like me simply being at the table all of a sudden means that everyone who talks then includes Aboriginal people and or issues in their comments. It is similar to other equity and diversity groups. Our conversations change, and in a good way, as we broaden our focus to aspects that may otherwise be overlooked. This is not only part of why First Nations people are needed in our representative structures, but also how they influence the culture and behaviour within those structures. I note you will also consider the sub-theme of access and outreach, also a good thing and one deserving of support. However, on this question too, we need to be aware that we can sometimes be a bit blinded in the process. For instance, it has long been a personal frustration that lots of policies, mostly those emanating from Canberra, have an Aboriginal focus that would have us believe all Aboriginal people live in remote areas of Australia. It is true that in lots of regional and remote areas, Aboriginal people are more visible, and in many such locations, they are proportionally more in number compared with non-Aboriginal people. It is also true that many Aboriginal people in rural and remote area Australia have particular needs. That is also true of Aboriginal people who live in areas not classified as rural or remote. For instance, in Western Australia, there are more Aboriginal people living in the bounds of the local government area of Swan than there are across the whole of the Kimberley. But one would never know that from the national policy directions apparently designed to address the needs of Aboriginal people. Similarly, more than half this state's Aboriginal population live in Noongar country, that is, the metropolitan area of Perth and the southwest. But it's sometimes hard to tell if that is actually understood by those developing policies. I want to return now to that other conversation, the one about decolonising, being able to walk in each other's shoes, being able to view the world through a different lens. And I want to think about that in the context of the pandemic, COVID-19. Now, I appreciate that's not something you'd necessarily think would apply, but maybe having something less obvious is a good place to start to demonstrate my point. You'll no doubt remember the angst people felt heading into what were lockdowns virtually across the planet. Here in Western Australia, we headed into what we were originally advised would be a 2 weeks hard lockdown. Remember, we are going back 18 months and lots has changed. We were told what a hard lockdown would mean for us all. Now, none of us particularly likes being told what to do. Rather, we like to think we're in control of our own lives and make the decisions that suit us from time to time. All of a sudden, we were told we'd be facing a different kind of life. We were told where we could be and where we could go. We were told where we could do those things, and in some places in Australia, there were curfews imposed. We were told who we could meet and in what numbers and circumstances. We were told how we could feel, how we could feed our families and provision our households. We were told how we could care for our old people and how we could school our young people. We were told how and with whom we could celebrate new life or marriage or grieve the passing of a loved one. We had to get permission and carry passes to be allowed to move from one area to another, including regional areas of our own state. I'm sure you remember all that within your own context and situation. Here, many people panicked and lots of people questioned how they would cope, essentially being locked in their homes for 2 weeks, unable to make counter decisions for themselves. A range of negative impacts were anticipated. Increased mental health issues, decreased family independence, increased financial strain, increased use of alcohol, increased incidence of family and domestic violence. And remember, in the context here, that was as we headed into the original 2 weeks of hard lockdown. Well, for Aboriginal people in this country, the conditions just outlined for those 2 weeks are what too many generations of us have experienced for around 200 years. Longer in jurisdictions like New South Wales. Yet we wonder why it is there are still issues in the Aboriginal community. To me, the pandemic is the perfect opportunity for non-Aboriginal Australia to get a glimpse into our lives. If not to walk in our shoes, then to at least know there's a shoe shop not too far away. It's an example that allows non-Indigenous people to view the world through a different lens, a First Nations lens. There are other significant matters that took place during those early COVID days. Matters such as Aboriginal communities taking more control of their lives as they returned from towns to their traditional lands. Discrete Aboriginal communities were closed by mandate of the state government and state government here, so that only people from those communities could be there. And kudos to them, that is the state government, they resisted calls from tourism operators to open those communities for tourism purposes. The government recognised the need for Aboriginal communities to be in control of their own destinies with support, as they hunkered down to keep themselves safe. And safe was actually what happened. We now have research published that uses this as an example of the better outcomes resulting from Aboriginal control than was otherwise the case. While they were at it, those communities thrived. Language and law renewal and cultural practice became a focus where it had not been able to be previously. Of course, nothing comes at no cost. For instance, in a number of Aboriginal communities, vaccine uptake has been very low, further endangering the lives of people already recognised as vulnerable. As you would expect, lots of this is about misunderstanding and misinformation. Some people think that because their particular community has been safe for them and they tend to stay in the community, they too will remain safe. They forget that others may also come to those communities and that they may unknowingly bring the COVID virus with them. In some Aboriginal communities, people who should know better have deliberately spread misinformation. Sadly, a number of those people are from religious groups. Another story for another time. There are other ways people can view the world through a different lens, an Aboriginal lens. In taking you to that place in your thinking, I want to go back to the Welcome to Country at the start of this session and talk a bit more about country and Aboriginal ways of thinking about country. Many people think about country and our care for it as being limited to just lands and waters, especially in our current times of recognising how we, people, are destroying the planet through climate change, land and water degradation, overuse of resources, overabundance of landfill, and so on. The need for land, water and air to be cleaner and in better supply makes a lot of sense. It is one of the things that again reminds me of the early days of the pandemic when the whole world went into lockdown. It didn't take long at all for waters and air to become clearer, to start to heal. I'm sure we all saw similar media photographs of some of that positive impact and how quickly things could change when there was whole planet action. In Australia, we've seen the negative impacts too: floods, droughts, infernos, infestations. It is clear we need to do something different and that we need to do it quickly. We need to heal country. Some of that thinking that has resulted has at last put Aboriginal cultures and cultural practices in the spotlight. By way of example, let's look at the terrible fires we've had here in Western Australia, as well as in the eastern states. I can tell you there are no Aboriginal dreaming stories that speak to the infernos those fires actually were. None. Because in the old times, we didn't experience that kind of catastrophe. Our care for and of country saw us farm with fire. In Noongar country, no part of the land went for more than 5 years without being burned, deliberately and with forethought as to its timing and location. No area was burnt out, including of big trees. Every area benefited, and many native plants need fire for them to even germinate. The build-up of underbrush as fuel for those massive fires was thus not an issue because things never got to that stage. Now there is more and more thinking about what lessons might be learned from those old ways, adapted to the modern context and applied for benefit. It is certainly one way to heal at least some of the country. But country to Aboriginal people is much more. When Aboriginal people talk about country, it's not about ownership or about property. Even terms like traditional owners are used in a legal sense. That's not actually us claiming to use the land or to own the land. Rather, it's a good example of how we all use language to invoke meaning. Ownership is a word we've adopted so non-Aboriginal people can understand in their context the closeness and importance of land. What it actually means to us is that we belong to that country and part of that country is in us. Country is more than a place. Country is family, kin, law, ceremony, traditions and language. And in that more personal context, country healing and care gives us all an opportunity to embrace Aboriginal cultural knowledge and understanding of country as part of Australia's national heritage, just as I've mentioned the example of fire. The right to protect country and culture is fundamental. Destruction and desecration of our sacred lands and ancient sites, some of the oldest human occupation sites on the planet, is an enormous loss for both our nation and the world. In the Western Australian context, we, sadly, have a very real example, that of the destruction last year of the Juukan Gorge caves, what they stood for and the ancient artefacts they held, which cannot be replaced. I wondered at the time, and I wonder still, what it would feel like to people of the Roman Catholic faith, for instance, if someone had blown up the Vatican. And of course, that one doesn't need to be of that faith to recognise the impact such destruction would mean to mankind. That it could happen for expediency and financial profit makes it far worse. With that example, the Vatican is more than the buildings or the artwork they hold. It is the history, the tradition, the connection, the memory. It is part of the world's culture, regardless of one's religious beliefs. Lots of the things we hold dear cannot be replaced, but they can be cared for, protected and safeguarded, nurtured and respected, remembered, and stories of them can be passed to our next generations. And we can all continue to learn from them as well as about them. As well as the more obvious physical aspects of country, healing and care must also take place for people, not only the first peoples of this land, but all who have followed. Generally, when I talk with people, the overwhelming emotion they express is one of anger, not at the fact of the conversation or the contents of it. Rather, their anger is the fact they didn't already know, that media too often reinforces negative stereotypes, that they weren't taught in school, that they therefore couldn't understand or empathise before. Learning and truly developing a deep understanding is part of the healing they need in order to truly connect to this place, to this country, to Australia. For Aboriginal people, that again circles us back to the impacts outlined that were expected consequences of our initial pandemic lockdown. Those impacts still need to be addressed in a comprehensive and concerted way. But it is more. It is our reconnection to culture and to language, both of which were at jeopardy as deliberate policies tried to remove us from them, and which remain a challenge for many of our young people. It is about overcoming the social determinants that impact on our life circumstances. Those impacts have been called many things over time. You may know them as indicators of Indigenous disadvantage. Essentially, they comprise the measures that tell us all about the disparity of outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. I tend to shy away from using statistics in conversations such as this, but there is one that I'd like you to hold in your minds, that of the Human Development Index. That index is an internationally ascribed score given to nations depending on a series of factors centred around three aspects: our life expectancy at birth, the extent of our education or learning, and the gross domestic product. Although Australia's ranking has slipped in the past few years, we are generally highly placed, often in the top 3 or 4 countries in the world. But a number of years ago, the Australian Bureau of Statistics did an exercise that tried to rank Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations against those same measures. When they did, in days when Australia as a whole nation, including us, was ranked about number 3, we, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, were ranked at 103. There is clearly much work to be done. And it is more than being about those things that are easy to measure, the outputs. It is also about the things that are hard to measure, the outcomes. For instance, whether someone did well on a test or if they achieved their goals on the job are easy to measure. Things like self-esteem are harder to measure, as is the impact on a person if they feel consistently discriminated against or overlooked. How do we measure the impact on a person who feels they are never heard? What are the issues of concern to them when they seem to lack relevance to others? Those questions lead us to question that you may have on your mind. If there are so many real issues that need to be addressed, then why is it that so much energy is currently being put into campaigns like Aboriginal people needing a voice to Parliament? Why is so-called truth-telling so important? Surely we cannot truly understand where we are today without knowing from where we've come. We need to know the full story and the true history of this country in order to build that better understanding of where we are today. Stories are integral to our culture as Aboriginal people. It is how we learn and pass on knowledge, and it is how we heal. We want to share with you the good stories, and there are many. We also want and need to share with you the other stories, and there are many of them too. And they need to not only be told, they need to be heard, and their impacts need to be understood. We are part of Australia's national heritage, and we want and need everyone in Australia, citizens and visitors, to equally respect the culture and values of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders as they do the cultures and values of all Australians. After some 200 years, our children and our future generations deserve better. And you know what? So does everyone. For generations, we've been calling for stronger measures to recognise, protect and maintain all aspects of our culture and heritage. We are still waiting for those robust protections. We seek substantive institutional, structural and collaborative reform. something generations of our elders and communities have been advocating, marching and fighting for a very long time. It is time to finally resolve many of the outstanding injustices which impact on the lives of our people. It is about hearing and actioning the aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which are the culmination of generations of consultation and discussion among our nations on a range of issues and grievances. We cannot afford to let pass the very real opportunity that now presents itself for reform based on a fundamental change in the relationship Australia has with Aboriginal people, its First Nations people. In Western Australia, that opportunity is 2029, when our collective and concerted march towards it, our shared journey, our walking together towards this state's bicentennial. Here, language is especially important. We ought not use the word celebrate when it comes to that anniversary milestone, because it will instantly tell at least some people that they are excluded, that they don't have enough in their lives to celebrate. A simple change to something like commemorate is perhaps not ideal, but it is better. It acknowledges that British settlement, colonisation, happened, but there is less danger of the alienation of at least some Aboriginal people. The challenge here is for us all to deeply think about what 2029 could be like, how it could be commemorated. Lots of people, including lots of Aboriginal people, will have ideas about that, but it is something that must be led by government. In order to do that, government must take account of many of the sub-themes on your agenda for these few days. Things like culture, people, sovereignty, representation, performance, responsiveness, reflection. And for those not based in Western Australia, those same sub-themes apply. Parliament, government, is not about always doing things as they've been done before. We have leaders in every aspect of our lives, including in our families and our communities, the places we work and our organisations. But political leadership is different, because here, decisions that are made impact on everyone. They truly are for the people. Let us make those decisions good ones. You are not alone. You have each other and what you can share with and learn from each other. And you have people like me who will work with you and stand beside you on that journey, because the journey you take is one for us all. I wish you well for your next few days of deliberations, and I thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts, circular and intertwining that they've been, to hopefully stimulate the conversations that is so important to the work you do. In Noongar language, we don't have a word for goodbye, so I say Borwin, which means until we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hayward. It's beyond me to sum up and do justice to your contribution. Your insights were deeply striking and challenging and thought-provoking, and we are indeed incredibly lucky to have you working with us and standing by us as we walk together. So we now move to the next part of the program, which is the formal election of the chair of the conference and the deputy chair of the conference. I'll let you move to the lectern if you like. So to conduct that, I'd like to introduce you to Nigel Pratt, who was the Honorary Secretary of the CPA WA branch. Nigel commenced with the Legislative Council in WA in 1999 as an advisory officer, and before being appointed to the role of clerk assistant. And in 2007, he furthered his parliamentary officer career in the Tasmanian Legislative Council. In 2014, Nigel was appointed the Clerk of the Legislative Council and Clerk of the Parliaments at the Parliament of Western Australia. Nigel has a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Jurisprudence and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Western Australia. And as Honorary Secretary of the CPA WA branch, Nigel is going to conduct our elections. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to everyone in person here in the Legislative Assembly Chamber in Perth, and welcome also to everyone participating online, particularly, and a special welcome to those in the Pacific who are participating in this Australia and Pacific Regional Conference. I'd firstly like to thank Richard Wally, Dr. Richard Wally, and Professor Colleen Hayward for their contributions today, and I think we should acknowledge that in an applause. And it seems strange for me to now, and quite appropriate for me, to do an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. So now I have some very boring housekeeping matters to talk to you about. The first one is evacuation. So in the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the direction of our fire wardens. They're the ones with the funny coloured hard hats. They'll direct you to an exit via the northern exit behind me and to a muster point on Harvest Terrace. The other thing I'd like to tell you about the in-person delegates is please keep your phone and your other devices muted. We haven't heard any feedback today, so I think you are doing all of that. Because if you're viewing the live feed with your sound on, we might get some feedback. So thanks everyone for your cooperation there. Okay, now it's my duty as the Honorary Secretary of the host branch to preside over the election of the conference chair. And given the hybrid nature of this conference, and of course with the permission of the chair who is elected, I will also preside over the election of the deputy chair. Please note, for those here and online, that only in-person delegates may be elected as chair, and only branch delegates may nominate, second a nomination, or vote. A vote will occur if there is more than one nominee. So I'll firstly call for nominations from in-person delegates. Are there any nominations for conference chair? The Honourable Nagree Akit. I call for a seconder. Jackie Jarvis. And I ask the Honourable Alana Clossy whether she accepts the nomination.
I do, thank you.
So the Honourable Alana Clossy has accepted the nomination for chair of the conference. Are there any speakers to the nomination? If there are no speakers, then I will now proceed to ask whether there are any further nominations from in-person delegates. No? Okay. Now, secondly, I call for nominations from online delegates to nominate an in-person delegate for the conference. Only an in-person delegate may be elected. For those online, if you wish to nominate any person who is here in the chamber, please type the name of your nomination in the live Q&A available on the Events Air phone app or to the right of your video stream. Nominations will close in 30 seconds. Nominations are now closed, and I've been informed by the moderator that there are no nominees from in-person delegates. I therefore declare that the Honourable Alana Clossy is elected Chair of this conference. I'll now proceed in the same manner for the election of the Deputy Chair of the conference. So I call for nominations for Deputy Chair from in-person delegates. The Honourable Jackie Jarvis.
As Deputy Chair.
Is there a seconder for that nomination? The Honourable Rosemary Armitage from Tasmania has seconded the nomination. Does anyone wish to speak to the nomination? Does anyone wish to make any further nominations? Does the Honourable Neree Kit accept the nomination? I'll now proceed to the online delegates. Is there any nominations for Deputy Chair from online delegates? The same process applies. To nominate, type into your Q&A, live Q&A in your Events Air phone app or the right of your video stream nominations. Any nominations that you have, they will close in 30 seconds. Voting is nominations are now closed on the app and on the Q&A, and I've been informed by the moderator that there are no online nominees for Deputy Chair. There being no further nominations, I declare the Honourable Neree Kit as Deputy Chair of the conference. I now invite the Chair of the conference and the Deputy Chair to make any remarks.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, delegates, for your nomination and for electing me as your chair. It is actually an honour and somewhat of a bit of a challenge, of course, because this is a hybrid conference. And while we are here in the chamber, we're also welcoming delegates across the region online. So welcome delegates online as well. We're indeed lucky to have the technology to enable this. And I think that we will be very practiced at conducting conferences like this, particularly at the end of this conference, but particularly over the last 12 months. And while this technology enables us to continue our work and to talk with each other and listen to each other. We also value the in-person contact, and so it's particularly wonderful to welcome our friends from Tasmania, Northern Territory and South Australia to Western Australia. This conference has a wide range of themes and presentations, and I know that each of us will be challenged by all of the content that we are about to engage with in this conference. Welcome and thank you to our Deputy Chair, the Honourable Nari Kit from Northern Territory, who I know will also make a particularly important contribution to our conference. So, delegates, thank you very much again, and I'll hand over to our Deputy Chair.
Thank you, honourable members and conference delegates. It's an absolute honour and privilege to be able to join you all in person today. Welcome to those who are joining us online as well. I'd just like to echo the sentiments of President Clossy as our chair of this conference and encourage the clear and close engagement. I want to thank everybody for contributing to such an amazing program this week. I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from everybody else's life experiences and experiences in the job. And thank you very much to Uncle Richard Wally and Auntie Colleen Hayward for the fantastic presentations this morning. I think it's really set an important tone for the conference going forward. I, being a proud Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman and a politician, really took a lot out of that. So I will continue to take my notes, support the chair of the conference going forward, and just encourage everybody to engage and contribute as much as you can. Thank you.
I will now hand back to the Honorary Secretary. When his lights come on. Welcome to our technical.
That's all right.
There you go.
They don't have them? Okay, that's good. So I'd just like to, welcome everyone again. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy Chair, for chairing this conference, this very important conference. We're fairly new to this hybrid arrangement, and being clerks, we tend to be fairly conservative people. So the timing on the program has been similarly conservative, and as a result, we've finished this particular part of the program early. So we're going to go to the in-person delegates are going to go to morning tea, and we'll pick up again at the next session at 11 a.m. with session 1A with a virtual address and a Q&A afterwards by the Honourable Joy Birch, Speaker of the ACT Legislative Assembly. So a timer will appear on your screen for those people who are virtual attendees, and the bells will ring before the next session. So thank you, in-person delegates and online delegates. I think you need a clapperboard then. So in the